All right, well, it was apropos when we're looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 6. Okay? And chapter 6, as we slow down to the beginning, dare any of you having a matter against another go to law before the unrighteous and not before the saints, and so on. So the civil law, or the government, what role does that have with the Christian life? And so we want to look at that. And what does God have to say about what believers are supposed to do to honor their civil authority? And so we went to Romans chapter 13. Scroll all the way down here. Excerpt from Romans chapter 13. It's very specific on this issue. A lot of little questions. So we got on down to individuals who do right by submitting. These are individual believers who do right by submitting to the authority of their rulers, civil rulers, with a godly conscience, free from a mental attitude of rebelliousness. You don't like your government a lot of times. Yet, God is sovereign, and He's put that civil authority over individual people in individual countries, peoples, groups of people. So, individuals, by submitting to the authority of their rulers with a godly conscience, free from a mental attitude of rebelliousness. That's hard. Suppose you're a German in Nazi Germany. They are placed, one, under the Lord's protection, are in a position to be free from fearing those in authority, and three, will be commended by them with that godly conscience. Rulers hold no terror for submissive individuals, but for those who do evil by resisting their authority. Since rulers are God's servants who bear the sword as avengers to execute God's wrath on those who practice evil, then one must be subject to one's rulers not only because of the potential of God's wrath, but also because of the conscience God has provided within them. So we're looking at the underlined verses, especially 13:2 through 5. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and he will commend you. Do what is right and wrong relative to the authority of the civil government. They're not biblical, probably, most likely, but you do right according to their authority over you. Now, that becomes a problem. We have to read more deeply into this. Suppose you're asked to violate God's moral laws. You got to do it respecting your faith and obedience to biblical principles, that God will protect you. For He is God's minister, the servant to do to you for good. A lot of faith in this. But if you do evil, be afraid, for He does not bear the sword in vain. So you do evil according to the Bible. For He is God's minister and an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. This is godly evil. As, civil authority, what they do is evil. If you go along with that, you're doing evil. Wherefore it is necessary to be subject not only because of the wrath, but also because of the conscience, the godly conscience. So, this has in view those who do right, i.e., those who submit to governmental authority with a godly conscience, free from a mental attitude of rebelliousness, who are consequently described as those for whom rulers hold no terror, no traumatizing fear of losing their authority or force through their position of authority. A lot of times governments don't care what moral point you have, just don't mess with their rules. See? Those who exemplify such submissiveness to authority are stipulated as doing right, good, relative good, as opposed to those who do wrong or evils. The latter referring to those who resist governmental authority, not biblical authority within the government, even if only in their attitude or conscience. Those who do right avoid the consequent temporal judgment of God, stipulated in verse 13:2, which we read. Then a question is posed in 13b, 13:3b. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? And the answer, then do what is right, good. And he, the ruler, will commend you. This implies that if the believer submits himself to his governing authorities and does not rebel against him in conscience or deed, he will be doing right in the sight of God and should be free from fear of the ones in authority over him. That's a big trust thing. Furthermore, it suggests that God will enable the believer who submits to governmental ruling authority to be protected and commended by his rulers. We're so fortunate in America. There are other countries that your belief system, if you go against the religious belief system that's affiliated, like in Muslim countries, with the governmental rule, you're going to suffer some punishment. So you can't rebel against that, but then again, you can't turn around and announce your belief system in that kind of a civil authority. So believers are endowed by God with a conscious understanding and mental impetus to choose to obey God, to consciously acknowledge and submit to the Lord's designated governmental authority over them. That's tricky. So Romans 13:4, for he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he, the ruler of the civil authority, does not bear the sword in vain, for he is God's minister and an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. Unbeknownst to he's not even a believer. Wherefore it is necessary to be subject not only because of the wrath, but also because of conscience. So Romans 13:4 indicates that a governmental authority, ruling authority, is God's servant to do the believer good when the believer submits to it with a godly conscience, free from a mental attitude of rebelliousness. Now, that's not to say that you don't act in a conscience according to the scriptures that teach you how to be godly. Thus, the believer is to trust in God to deliver him from fear and harm, as he is faithful to God's command to be subject to his governing authorities in godly conscience and deed. Hence, the believer is not to fear punishment from the ruler when he is submissive. On the other hand, if the believer or any subject under the authority does wrong by evidencing rebellion to the ruler, against the ruler in conscience and or deed, he should be afraid. For the ruler, as God's servant, bears the sword by God's design, in the sense of having the armed capacity and authority to exact physical punishment, even death, upon a rebellious subject, in order to bring God's wrathful punishment on the wrongdoer. So, verse 13:5 then corroborates that it is necessary to submit to authorities not only because of possible punishment, but also because of conscience. This implies that believers are endowed by God with a conscience, a conscious understanding and mental impetus to choose to conform to God's command, to consciously acknowledge and submit to the Lord's designated governmental authority over them. If they trust in and are faithful to him, then they will be protected from harm and even commended by that ruler, despite the differences in politics. So, one must submit oneself to governmental authority in actions and in conformance with one's conscience, with one's godly conscience, with the knowledge that God is sovereign and he's appointed that government over you, no matter how evil it is. You're in the position. I mean, how evil was the Roman government? But Paul was underneath it, and he honored it. And most of the time, he wasn't in that much trouble with it. So, godly conscience, action backed up by a godly attitude of submission. That doesn't mean that you don't disagree with their philosophy and their way of treating people, but you have to have a godly attitude of submission to their authority. Hence, one must not have a mental attitude of resisting governmental authority, no matter how badly they wield their authority, while submitting to one's rulers. Otherwise, one is still resisting governmental authority and liable to receive the wrath of God. Let God have the handle on it. So one is to maintain a godly conscience toward God relative to constantly acknowledging and submitting to one's governmental authorities with the understanding that they have been appointed over one by God as his servants to do his will. A lot of times, an evil government will overcome another evil government, and you're right in the middle of it. But a lot of times you get protected. People receive from God the kind of government that they deserve. That reflects their character, that mirrors their response to their God-given conscience. In order to be blessed by God with a godly ruling authority, the people's actions and responses to their consciences must largely be godly and free from reflecting an unwillingness to submit to governmental rulers, even when the rulers are evil, inept, or corrupt. So since ruling authorities are appointed by God, and since the character of ruling authorities varies from godly to ungodly, mostly the latter, largely reflecting the people they rule, then groups of people forming rulerships, cities, villages, states, nations, and so on, receive from God the kind of government that they deserve, that mirrors their character, that reflects the responses to their godly given consciences. Hence, a God-given conscience. Hence, a people who exemplify a pattern of ungodliness will eventually receive an ungodly ruler, sending them in the direction of self-destruction. This implies that the character of ruling authorities, being under God's sovereign control, will be changed to reflect the character of its people. So in order to be blessed by God with a godly ruling authority, the people's actions and responses to their God-given consciences must largely be godly and free from reflecting an unwillingness to submit to governmental rulers, even when the rulers are evil, inept, or corrupt, which is most often the case. So even personal accusations from rulers cannot be answered in a manner which, even if true, undermine the authority of one's rulers. An accusation of a governmental ruler of corruption, ineptitude, greed, etc., evil, and so on, in a manner which in the ruler's mind encourages rebellion against his authority or undermines his authority, is not justified before God, even if the accusation is true. God put that ruler in place and will take him out by godly means and not through ungodly tactics. When rulers can be changed by some kind of election, godly tactics must be used by the candidates or suffer the consequences. So smear campaigns, evil debating tactics, innuendos, wars, etc. are not permitted. False accusations by incumbent rulers toward others, no matter how evil and untrue, can only be answered in such a fashion that does not undermine the authority of that incumbent ruler. Pretty tricky. This leaves the result in God's hands, an example of walking by faith. Besides, everything is in God's hands. Even a representative of a church who's a godly man, don't try to usurp his authority. You may think you're knowledgeable in some way, but he's still over that congregation. And perhaps I've done that a number of times. I don't know, where a pastor, I confront the pastor because he's not teaching the gospel correctly, but God has placed that pastor over that congregation. And actually, he's over that congregation because of the character of the people in that congregation. And it may be that none of them are believers. See, so you try to not usurp the authority because God has placed them in that authority, yet you find a way to try to find a means by which you can have a good conversation with that pastor. Most of the time, not. So the campaign of the godly man is to be the same as this godly lifestyle, one of walking by faith, and as an example to others. If the nation seeks a godly ruler who is supported by God himself, then he will be placed in a position as ruler by God through election or other means. God is holy and righteous God, who does not contradict himself by commanding rulers or believers to issue or obey unrighteous commands respectively. So the believers to refuse to obey commands, that violate the holiness of God in a manner which still respects the governmental authority. Again, I said that's pretty tricky. God is a holy and righteous God who does not contradict himself by commanding rulers or believers to issue or obey unrighteous commands respectively. I repeat on this, it's so important. So the believers to refuse to obey commands that violate the holiness of God in a manner which still respects government authority. Most of the time, rulers come after you, not because you have a different philosophy, because you don't want to obey their rules. Although Romans 13, 1-5 makes it clear that believers are commanded by God to be subject to their governing authorities, this is not to say that the believer must obey the commands from governmental authority. Let me fix that. Which violate God's righteousness. For it is God, the righteous one, who commands righteousness, not evil, who has placed all rulers in positions of authority, evil or not. God is a holy and righteous God who does not contradict himself by commanding rulers or believers to issue or obey